On Wednesday, July 8th, 2026, a poison wind blew across Salt Lake City. It didn't come from a chemical plant. It didn't come from a fire. It rose from the floor of a dead lake, a massive dust storm whipped from over 1,000 square miles of exposed lakebed, descended on more than 1 million people. Dr. Kevin Perry, a scientist at the University of Utah, watched the monitors. The air filled with particulate matter so fine it bypasses the body's defenses. PM10 concentrations spiked to 4 times the healthy limit, and that dust carried a payload: arsenic, lead, antimony, heavy metals, and cyanotoxins left behind by a dying ecosystem. Dr. Perry put it plainly: the dust event was dangerous, not a future threat, not a theoretical risk, dangerous right now. But here's what nobody understood in that moment, choking on the air from their own dying lake. The dust was just the symptom, the visible, terrifying proof of a much larger crisis. A crisis of water, of hubris, of a century of bad math finally coming due. And the same disease that was killing the Great Salt Lake was already silently at work 400 miles to the south, hollowing out the single largest water reservoir in the United States, a lake that 40 million people depend on to survive. They are 2 separate bodies of water, 2 different systems, but they are telling the exact same story, a story of a civilization built on water that is no longer there. The Great Salt Lake is the warning you can see. Lake Mead is the catastrophe you can't. Yet the Great Salt Lake was never supposed to be tamed. It's a terminal lake, an endorheic basin. Those are the scientific terms. What it means is simple. Water flows in, but it never flows out. For millennia, 3 main rivers, the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan, have poured fresh water into this vast, shallow bowl. The only exit has ever been evaporation. The sun beats down, the water rises as vapor, and all the minerals, all the salts, get left behind. This is why the lake is salty. It is a basin of accumulation, a geological memory bank. For 150 years, it has been remembering one thing above all else: our thirst. Since 1850, we have systematically starved the lake. Every farm, every suburb, every new resident along Utah's Wasatch Front has been a diversion, a straw sipping from the rivers before they can reach their final destination. The lake became a barometer for the region's growth, and the pressure has been falling for decades. Relentlessly, today it has lost over 73% of its water volume. More than half of its surface area is simply gone. A lakebed that was once underwater, a thriving ecosystem of brine shrimp and migratory birds, is now 1,183 square miles of toxic dust, exposed to the wind. It is a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow-motion catastrophe that for decades nobody in a position of power was willing to stop. They saw the lake not as an ecosystem, but as a resource to be managed. Or ignored. Joel Ferry, the commissioner of Utah's Department of Natural Resources, finally gave the threat a name. He called the shrinking lake a potential environmental nuclear bomb. And as of 2026, the countdown is getting terrifyingly short. The disappearance was supposed to be gradual, a problem for the next generation. Then the timeline collapsed. In November of 2022, the Great Salt Lake hit its all-time record low elevation, 4,188.5 feet. A number that sent a shockwave through the local scientific community. A coalition of researchers from Brigham Young University, led by ecologist Dr. Benjamin Abbott, ran the models. Their conclusion, published in January 2023, was not a polite academic warning. It was a 5-alarm fire. They stated flatly that without an emergency rescue of 2.5 million acre-feet of water delivered annually, the lake was on track to disappear entirely. By 2028, not a century, not a decade, 5 years. Dr. Abbott did not mince words. We are talking about an existential threat to our way of life. That was the worst-case scenario. Then the worst case got worse. The winter of 2026 arrived with almost no snow. The snowpack in the mountains that feed the rivers, the very lifeblood of the entire state, is measured in something called snow water equivalent, or SWE. In March of 2026, at the peak of the season, Utah's snowpack measured just 8.4 inches of SWE, the lowest peak ever recorded. All the past dry years, all the previous records, this was worse. The spring runoff, the annual pulse of water that the state depends on for everything, vanished months ahead of schedule. Brian Steed, the state's inaugural Great Salt Lake Commissioner, a man hired specifically to solve this crisis, stepped down from his post on July 1st, 2026. 2 years of work, and the lake was lower. The dust was blowing, and the snow had never come. Was it a vote of no confidence in the entire project of saving the lake? Or was it just the quiet recognition that the problem was now bigger than any one person, any one state, could possibly solve? Because here is the part nobody wants to talk about at dinner parties in Salt Lake City. The megadrought that starved the Great Salt Lake is not a local phenomenon. It is a 2-decade climate change-fueled crisis stretching across the entire American West, and it is hammering an even bigger, more critical system. The Colorado River, the river that created Lake Mead. This is where the story goes from a local environmental disaster to a regional crisis of survival. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, formed by the Hoover Dam on September 30th, 1935. It is the water bank for 40 million people. For Los Angeles, for Phoenix, for Las Vegas, for the vast agricultural valleys of Arizona and Southern California. It was built on the same flawed foundation as Utah's water planning. An agreement signed in 1922, the Colorado River Compact, that allocated more water than the river actually carries in an average year. For a century, the system has been running a deficit, drawing down its savings account, and that savings account is now dangerously close to zero. The media loves to talk about one number, 895 feet. That's the elevation for Deadpool. The point at which water in Lake Mead can no longer flow past Hoover Dam to California, Arizona, and Mexico. At that point, the system breaks. It's a terrifying number, but it's also a distraction. The real crisis isn't Deadpool. The real crisis happens much, much sooner. The real crisis arrives at 1,035 feet. And we are terrifyingly close to it, 1,035 feet. That's the number you need to hold in your head. It is the power cliff. Below that elevation, the water pressure inside Lake Mead becomes too low for 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 massive turbines to operate safely. They have to be shut down. This isn't a choice. It's physics. At that point, the dam's power generation capacity could be cut by as much as 75%. The lights don't just flicker for millions of people across the Southwest. They go out. But it's the why that is so staggering. The reason the turbines have to be shut down is a phenomenon called cavitation, and it is the stuff of engineering nightmares. Cavitation is what happens when the pressure of the water flowing through the turbines drops so low that the water itself starts to boil. Not from heat, but from a lack of pressure. Tiny pockets of vapor, of empty space, form in the liquid. These bubbles are then swept into areas of higher pressure inside the turbine housing, where they collapse. Violently, the implosion of these tiny bubbles generates shock waves. Temperatures at the point of collapse can reach thousands of degrees, and the pressure is immense. It is like a million microscopic hammer blows hammering away at the solid steel of the turbine blades. Over time, cavitation doesn't just erode the metal. It blasts chunks out of it. It destroys the machinery from the inside out. Running the Hoover Dam turbines below the 1,035-foot mark is like intentionally feeding them gravel. As of July 11th, 2026, Lake Mead sits at an elevation of 1,042, 89 feet. Do the math. That is less than 8 feet away from the power cliff. 8 feet. After dropping hundreds of feet over 2 decades, the margin for error is now smaller than the height of a single-story building. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages the dam, is not optimistic. Their own models, projecting forward based on the disastrously low snowpack of 2026, forecast that Lake Mead could plummet to between 1,015 and 1,020 feet by July of 2027. That is not just at the power cliff, that is well below it. They are planning for the worst case, because in the desert, The worst case keeps arriving ahead of schedule. But here is where the story takes a ruthless turn. A plot twist built of concrete and steel, hidden deep beneath the surface of the lake. A secret that ensures that when the catastrophe finally arrives, the suffering will not be shared equally. If Lake Mead drops below dead pool, the great canals that feed Southern California and central Arizona go dry. The cities of Los Angeles and Phoenix face an existential water crisis, but Las Vegas will be fine. Las Vegas will have water. Because Las Vegas planned for the apocalypse. It was not a growth strategy. It was a survival strategy. While the other states were arguing over paper water rights, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the SNWA, was drilling. They saw the bathtub ring on the walls of Lake Mead, the geological scar marking the lake's relentless decline, and they understood it was a harbinger. Their first two intake pipes, built in 1971 and the 1990s, were positioned at 1,050 feet and 1,000 feet. By the early 2000s, water managers could see a future where the lake dropped below both of them, leaving the fastest-growing city in America with no way to access its only water source. Not a shortage. Gone. Completely. So they did something audacious. Nearly impossible. Between 2015 and 2020, the SNWA completed what they called Intake No. 3 in an adjacent low lake level pumping station. It is an engineering marvel born of pure desperation. They drilled a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock, deep beneath the floor of Lake Mead itself. At the end of that tunnel, they built an intake structure that pulls water from the absolute bottom of the reservoir. An elevation of 860 feet, that is 35 feet below dead pool. Think about what that means. When the lake level sinks to 895 feet and the Hoover Dam gates can no longer release water downstream, when California's water is officially cut off, Las Vegas can keep pumping. Their third straw is essentially a drain pipe at the bottom of the tub. It guarantees their survival at the direct expense of everyone else downstream. It was a $1.5 billion bet on a future where cooperation failed, and right now, that bet looks like the smartest money ever spent. The politics of this are brutal. For years, the 7 basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California, have been locked in a bitter fight over how to share a shrinking river. The federal government, under the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, has repeatedly ordered them to come up with a plan to voluntarily cut their water usage. Every deadline has been met with proposals, counter-proposals, and ultimately failure. The states with older, more senior water rights, like California, have refused to give up what they see as their legal entitlement. The states with faster-growing populations, like Arizona, have argued that the old math no longer applies. Finally, in June of 2026, the federal government lost its patience. The 7 states had failed, once again, to reach an agreement. So, acting USPR Commissioner Scott Cameron, who took over after Camille Touton stepped down, announced that the feds were taking the wheel. The Bureau of Reclamation is now moving forward with its own 10-year river management framework. They will dictate the cuts. They will issue the new operating guidelines every 2 years, responding to the crisis as it unfolds. The era of state-level negotiation is over. An emergency federal takeover of the most important river in the West has begun. Not through legislation, through desperation. And the Great Salt Lake just keeps drying up. The wind keeps blowing. The dust from the lake bed doesn't just choke the residents of Salt Lake City. It is creating a public health crisis that is permanent and that you cannot escape. In April of 2026, a landmark study from Utah State University finally proved what scientists had feared for years. The toxins in the Great Salt Lake dust are entering the food supply. Researchers Blakowski and Brawny discovered that leafy greens, vegetables grown in the region, are absorbing the heavy metals from the Jessel dust directly into their biological structure, through their roots. Let that sink in. This isn't a film of dust that you can just wash off in the sink. The arsenic, the uranium, the lead, it is becoming part of the plant itself. It is being woven into the food chain. Every dust storm is now a crop dusting event, delivering a cocktail of neurotoxins and carcinogens that will accumulate in the soil, in the plants, and ultimately in the people who eat them. An invisible poison delivered on the wind. It is a double-barreled threat. Dr. Perry, the atmospheric scientist who has spent years riding his bicycle across the exposed lake bed, testing the soil, tried to explain this after the July 8th dust storm. He said it doesn't matter what the dust is made out of. If those PM10 concentrations are high enough, it can cause immediate respiratory problems for people. First, the fine particulates themselves cause acute inflammation, triggering asthma attacks and damaging lung tissue. That is the immediate danger. But then there is the second, slower danger. The toxic payload the dust carries. Every breath is a small dose of poison. Every salad grown in local soil is another. 2 lakes. 2 unfolding disasters. One is loud, visible, a choking cloud of poisoned earth that everyone can see and feel. The other is quiet, silent, a number on a screen, ticking down, foot by foot, toward a cliff. The Great Salt Lake crisis is a failure of vision, a century of letting a precious resource evaporate for the sake of development. The Lake Mead crisis is a failure of math, a century of promising more water than the sky ever delivered. But they are connected. They are the twin death rattles of a system pushed beyond its limits. The aridification of the American West is unforgiving. The ground is dry, the snow is scarce, and the demand has never been higher. We built cities where they did not belong. We grew crops that should not have been grown. We made promises based on a climate that no longer exists. The engineers did their jobs. They drilled the tunnels. They built the dams. They threaded needles through mountains, blindfolded, underwater. In Las Vegas, they drilled a hole so deep it could suck the last drops from a dying lake, ensuring one city's survival while its neighbors faced ruin. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering, a monument to human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. But engineering cannot make it rain. Engineering cannot put water back into the ground that has been depleted for 100 years. The third straw, the Vegas loophole, was not a solution. It was a transfer of risk. And the toxic, dust-blanketing Salt Lake City is not a freak event. It is the new normal, the logical endpoint of a system that treated the environment as an externality. So the real question is not whether Las Vegas saved itself. The question is what happens when the rest of the West realizes that there are not enough third straws to go around. What happens when the dust storms from the Great Salt Lake become so frequent and so toxic that cities become unlivable? Did the federal government's takeover of the Colorado River come in time to manage an orderly crisis, or did it just put Washington in charge of presiding over a collapse? The crisis is here. It arrived exactly on schedule. The poison is in the air, and it's in the food. The power is about to be cut. There is no more time to plan. There is only time to react. The clock is running on 2 of the most critical water bodies in North America, and we are about